Hi everyone, this is Manar. I'm currently a first year PhD student at Brown, and I graduated from the American University in Cairo in 2020 with a bachelor's degree in computer engineering. And in this talk, I'll be presenting Volt, which is an open source design for testing solution. To start with, what is DFT or design for testing So DFT is mainly concerned with adding extra testability logic into the design in order to make it testable after manufacturing. So putting this into context within the ASIC design flow, you will find that the TFT logic insertion step comes right after the RTL logic synthesis and partitioning of the chip, and it happens right before the floor planning step. And why is it important to add like extra testability logic into the design? And this is because of what is called the rule of 10, which says that any failure to detect a faulty chip will incur a cost that continues to get multiplied by 10 as the chip goes from packaging till the end user. In other words, the main objective of DFT is to detect and eliminate faulty chips after manufacturing in order to avoid having to spend the money on packaging and shipping a faulty product to the end user. So as important as DFT is, we currently have a gap in the open source space when it comes to open source DFT solutions. So if you look at the current landscape of open source DFT tools, you will find two very famous tools. One is called the Atalanta and the other one is called Podem. But they suffer from a major drawback, which is that they don't support standard EDA file formats. And also Atlanta comes with the non-permissive license, which restricts use to commercial products. So our main objective with Volt is to address this gap by introducing an open source design for testing solution that supports standard EDA file formats and that also comes with a permissive license, which allows for commercial and academic use. So this is the main diagram of how Volt's flow work. As you can see here, we have two main activities going on. We have the automatic test pattern generation, or ATPG for short. And the main objective of this part of the flow is generating an input sequence, or what we call as a test vector, that can be applied to the chip in order to detect whether it has a manufacturing error or not. And the second part of the flow is called the chain insertion. And the main objective of this part is adding the extra testing logic into the design. So the main process that we have here is called the cut. And as you can see here, our starting point in the flow is the synthesized netlist. And this netlist comes from the RTL logic synthesis step. And this synthesized netlist goes through the first process, which is called the cut. And this process outputs a combinational only netlist, which only contains combinational logic. And then we pass this netlist through a PGen step, and this step runs a number of gate level simulations that finally outputs a test vector set or an input sequence. And then we pass this test vector set through a compact process, which reduces the size of the set itself in order to reduce the cost of testing. And for the chain insertion part, we have two main processes. We have the chain process, which constructs a scanned chain through the netlist flip-flops. And the final process that we have is the tap process, and this process attaches a JTAG controller to the constructed scanned chain, and it outputs a netlist with the JTAG controller inside it. And this is like the final netlist that goes through the ASIC, the rest of the ASIC flow. So going into more detail into how each process works, the first process is the cut process. And as I said, this process takes as an input the synthesized netlist, which comes from the RTL logic synthesis, and it outputs a netlist that's composed only of combinational logic. So for example, in this diagram, we have a netlist with 3 flip-flops. And when it goes through the cut process, the 3 flip-flops will be removed. and their input and output ports will be exposed as input and output ports of the like to the top netlist itself. And we do this because we use this netlist for running the ATPG simulation, which happen in the next step, which is what we call PGen, and the input to this step is the combinational only netlist generated by CUT. And this step generates an input sequence or a test vector using a pseudo-random number generator. And the main objective of this test vector is to tell us whether the chip is faulty or not. And to determine whether this generated test vector can detect whether a chip is faulty or not, we run a fault simulator or a fault simulation. And inside this fault simulation, we have two models for the circuit. We have a golden model and we have a faulty model. The golden model simulates the correct behavior of the circuit, and the faulty model simulates how a faulty chip would behave if a certain fault site is stuck at 0 or stuck at 1. And in order to determine whether the generated vector can detect a faulty chip or not, we compare the output response of the two models. And if there is a match, then we know that the generated vector cannot detect a faulty model. And if there's a difference between the output of the golden model and the faulty model, then we know that the test vector can detect a faulty chip. And if there's a difference, we then add this generated test vector into the final output test vector set. And also the ATPG process outputs a coverage percentage, which tells us how many fault sites this set covers out of all fault sites present in the circuit. And because this process is pseudo-random and it is the test vectors are randomly generated, we end up with a lot of redundant test vectors. And by redundant here, I mean test vectors that can cover the same fault site. So we had to introduce a compact step into faults flow. And the main objective of the compact process is to reduce the size of the generated test vector set without affecting the coverage percentage. And briefly, this is done by constructing a table where the rows of the table constitute the test vectors and the columns constitute the the available fault sites in the circuit. And iteratively, we remove the row with the highest number of detectable faults. And we'll continue doing this process until all the faults are detected. And the output of the compact step is the compacted test vector set, which is supposedly smaller in size and has the same coverage percentage as the original test vector set. And after the automatic test pattern generation is done, we then do the chain insertion. And this is the part of the flow which adds the extra testability logic into the design. And mainly in the chain step, we add a multiplexer for each flip-flop input. And we also add what is called the boundary cell. And this boundary cell is composed of a flip-flop and two multiplexers. And this boundary cell is added to the input and the output ports of the chip. And the main purpose of the multiplexer here is to switch between the testing and the functional mode of the circuit. And this is done by a control signal here called shift. And finally, after all the extra logic is added into the design, we construct a huge or like a scanner chain through the input boundary cells, the internal flip-flops of the circuit, and the output boundary cells. And we finally expose two serial ports, one for shifting in the generated test vector, and one for shifting out the response from the combinational logic inside the circuit. And the final step in faults flow is called the tap. And this step attaches a JTAG controller the JTAG controller is like an IEEE standard for testing. So this JTAG makes the circuit compatible with the automatic testing equipment available in the fab. This step attaches the JTAG controller to the constructed scan chain in the previous step, and it exposes 5 extra ports from the top netlist. And these ports, one for the test data in, which is used for shifting in the generated test vector, and the test data out, which is used for shifting out the testing. And we have also a testing clock port, and we have a TMS port, which is used for navigating the finite state machine inside the temp controller here. And this is used for putting the circuit inside the testing mode or putting it out of the testing mode. And we also have a test reset signal. So we evaluated faults performance on a number of designs. And our first metric was the coverage percentage. And we tried like different benchmarks with different gate count, and the fault performed on average, reported on average a coverage percentage of 96%. And our second metric was the runtime. And because the ATPG simulation tend to run very slowly, we had to introduce threading here. And with 10 threads, the average runtime for fault was around 1 hour. And we also evaluated the performance of the compaction algorithm, and this was done by comparing the size of the original test vector set and the compacted test vector set. And as you can see here, for very large test vector sets that of size 5,000, the compaction algorithm was able to remove all of the redundant vectors and reduce the size to 126. But for test vectors that were already compact and didn't contain a lot of redundant test vectors, the reduction in size was not that great. Like for example, in these 2 parts, the compaction algorithm was able only to remove 2 redundant test vectors. And this is because the original test vector was already compact. And finally, we owe faults development to a number of open source tools. We used USIS for running the RTL logic synthesis, and we used iVerilog for running the ATPG simulations. And finally, we used the PyVerilog for doing the manipulation of the netlist structure, like inserting the scan chain and attaching the JTAG controller. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.